Jim, I just emailed you about the last request.
Okay, I'll take a look. All right, thank you.
No, they're not all on yet, though.
Morning, everyone.
Hey, David.
So I guess it's, why don't we give him one more minute, 10:03, and then we'll start. So the general idea I have, was if we give Stu the floor for a while, maybe we'll say until, with 20 minutes or so, Stu. And then,
It is.
yeah, and then if we could hold the questions to he's done with his thought process, what he's gonna clarify what his proposal was. And I think the reality is the only, I guess, proposal that we've seen as this group to help reduce the cost or control costs for housing with respect to wastewater came from Sue. So we really don't have anything else to consider along those lines. So Stu, you wanna fire it off?
I'm sorry, did Deep's proposal and information not get submitted?
Yes, you did, but the goal of this committee, as we understand it, was to find ways to reduce the cost of housing, yet not hurt the environment. We did not see anything along those lines in that proposal, but if you want to clarify after Stu how that would reduce the cost of housing, we're certainly open to it.
So who's the we? Because I'm pretty sure we're supposed to discuss the proposals in this group and then make a
That's
determination.
correct.
Okay, so we have not discussed them, right? We've provided feedback as we were requested to.
Let me clarify. What I said was the proposal that we got as a group, I did not see any suggestions as to how to reduce the cost of housing in what you submitted. But once Stu is complete, if you'd like to clarify how that actually reduces the cost of housing, we as a group are certainly open to hearing that.
Well, I think that, right, I don't think what you're saying is accurate. And I think you're dismissing what Deep has submitted, and you are making a single choice here to say there are no cost savings.
What I'm saying is, it was not apparent to me. We as a group can discuss that. You're happy, if you would like to explain to us how that will reduce the cost of housing, your proposal, we as a group are open to that.
Interesting. Okay.
All right, you want to, Stu, explain or clarify your thought process?
Yeah. Okay, are we on? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I think Dave and Audra they're back and forth just to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about here. Bottom line is, I read the statute, we're supposed to balance public health and the environment against, generally speaking, cost of housing, affordability, I think is implicit in that. So, one of the things that is apparent, and I'm not pointing fingers, but I think it is a fair statement to say that a project which is submitted to DPH and goes through a 30 to 60-day review period. Sometimes there's comments, but generally, we end up with a consensus and get an approval. Is then contrasted something of, we'll call that the 7,500 gallon one under current regulations. If we go to 7,501 gallons and go to Deep, 12 months is the inside, 18 months is pretty common to get to public notice. because it's got to go not only get somebody to review it, but also then go through the staff review, do the cut, address the comments and so forth. Bottom line is time and use of money. There's a big cost savings. That's a low hanging fruit here. Developer goes for, if we do let's figure we're talking about 100-bedroom, whether it's a condominium or apartment complex, which we would think would be more in the, we'll call it the median to low median range pricing, and there's probably an affordable component under 830G in that. If you look at that, he's probably going to spend 30 or 40 million bucks. His initial funding that he's got to arrange just to do that, either out of pocket, from investors or from a bank, might be 20 or 25%. You tie up 10 million bucks for a year or 18 months at prevailing commercial rates of about 7%. That's 700,000 to 1.2 million. If that's not a cost savings, please tell me what is. So I'm trying to come up with ways that are reasonable, closely aligned with the framework of DPH, the way it's already set up, with some obvious changes. Now, where are we today with DPH? Up to 7,500 gallons a day goes to DPH. There is the regulatory threshold of maximum 7,500 gallons per property. That goes back almost 50 years ago to when Randy May set up the program. And that was 5,000 at the time. And it's proven to be kind of we'll call it an impediment, but also an aggravation, if you will, because when people want to feel like they can do their project with two or more septic systems that meet DPH criteria, we routinely put a subdivision line somewhere in there, develop them as two disjointed projects. That also falls back into efficiency and affordability, various costs. It is not efficient to build two projects with two 7,500 gallon a day septic systems, but with all of the utilities, the infrastructure, and everything else built separately. Costs more. It cannot be argued otherwise. So, bottom line, I was trying to find a way that we could use what? Matt's Group. Is Matt on here? Did Matt not? Okay. Anyway, Matt's Group came up with that proposal last year that had incorporated the jump to 10,000 gallons a day, but also incorporated a very simple, and I think we can all agree, a nitrogen component that could be and should be augmented or modified a little bit for some of the bigger septic systems. So I tried to kind of follow those guidelines in coming up with some ideas. Now I'm going to go. I hope everybody's got a copy of what I wrote. To keep this as short as possible, and I am a big talker, as you can tell, I'm just going to go to the last page where it says the heading is updated proposal incorporating nitrogen subgroup discussions. Now, number one is eliminate that gallon per day per property threshold. Because it was headed for 10,000, I simply put 10,000 on there and said, look, if we're all going to agree, we're going to go to 10,000 gallons a day per septic system as regulated by DPH. There's no reason to be bouncing that around. But taking out this property line restriction with other modifications and safeguards, which I think are down below if you really think them through, that this can all work, and it furthers our objective of trying to keep costs down, move things ahead. The other day they signed the governor signed that bill for housing. They're using the terms housing crisis and both affordability and housing crisis. Waiting an additional 12 to 18 months to move your project forward doesn't get people in houses. That's the fact. So anyway, this is the biggest part, I think, the meat of my proposal is this component of it. I think you've already got regulations that are at 7,500 gallons a day. There is in the DPH regulations, there's already that minimum leaching system spread regulation. That is their version of a hydraulic analysis. It is not perfect, but none of them are. I will make the comment that it is a two-dimensional analysis. I think one of the other members of the group, and I've forgotten who, mentioned 2- and 3-dimensional analysis on a hillside, which is where it is used most often. It is a two-dimensional analysis. It does take into account hydraulic conductivity. It is linear, which is a two-dimensional, the hallmark of a two-dimensional analysis. So basically, all this does is it takes the lot line out. And we've had this discussion in our group before. A lot line does nothing for the environment. I'm sorry, that's the fact. That the environment does not benefit from it. Now, I realize everybody's thinking to themselves, oh no, you know, somebody's gonna put a bunch of septic systems on a single piece of property. So we jump down, we've already talked about number 2, authorized DPH up to 10,000. That's what they proposed. I said, we're trying to work within the framework. That was, you know, last year's proposal. I said, just stick with it. We get to the nitrogen assessment. This is basically what Matt had, but it retains the existing regulation with, if you jump down to, through this, it explains what we're doing with between at 7,500. We were seeing this, jumping backwards from 7,500 to 5,000 and putting the nitrogen assessment into that is kind of a step backwards. Again, looking at it from the perspective of what's cost effective, what moves projects forward. That's kind of where that comes from. But then when you jump down to 4, this is where you see we're incorporating some safeguards here. The assessment model in the 2025 regs to incorporate appropriate site-specific infiltrative surface coefficients and watershed areas, blah, blah, blah. We're going to say we're going to add appropriate site-specific infiltrative surface coefficients. What that means is it is very closely aligned with the DEEP model. Now, the DEEP model is much more subjective. There's a couple of tables in there where you can go through, but what the DEEP model doesn't do and what we can do with this, and I'm going to make this point, if my company was developing plans for a development of any size, we're going to be doing a stormwater management plan, stormwater management report. Part of that is a stormwater runoff, a report of runoff from various surfaces on the project. So as far as I think it's a safe assessment or safe bet to say, every engineering company is already going to have the various surfaces in their project broken out by area. And the reason that this is important is the model that DPH had proposed didn't take into account various surfaces on a project. In other words, the most basic ones, and the way I think it could be simply done in a cookbook fashion, is to break it out by impervious, which includes roofs, driveways, sidewalks, and the like, grass areas and landscape areas, and areas that are retained as wooded or natural. You would also subtract out those areas that are inland wetland, any wetland or watercourse. Basically, you don't get to count that as an infiltrated area. So I'll go to we'll call it, I'm going to use the term buildable area. Buildable, is bounces around. The definition of that is nebulous because it might include everything right up to the boundary of the property, or it might include everything to the boundary of an inland wetland. There's no reason why those areas can't be counted for nitrogen dilution, but you don't get to count those areas into which water cannot be absorbed. Also, let me back up. So in terms of the infiltrative surface, what's going to happen is pavement's going to get basically a 0. If you pave the entire site and all the water runs off, sorry, you do not get credit for nitrogen dilution. If, on the other hand, you pick up your water and you have a sufficient area to infiltrate it, you get some credit for that. And that would be the way that would work. lawn areas and wooded areas are basically, we would look at them in terms of the rational coefficient of runoff, which is the rational method for stormwater estimation of stormwater runoff. That's the one that the DOT used for a million years. And basically, it's the reverse of that. So if you were getting a 30% runoff coefficient, it's 1 minus 0.3 minus evapotranspiration, and you might get back to the 60% infiltration rate. That's something in a lawn. We can talk about that. These are outlines. We can get to that. And then a wooded area gets a very high infiltrative coefficient of probably 0.7 or something like that. Because water goes into the ground and is then available for dilution. Remember that the models that are used are annual average models. That is the way Deep's model works now. It is an annual average. It is not we calculate it generally on a day-to-day basis, but it's an annual average based on annual runoff and based on average annual precipitation. And I've done many of them, so I'm really very confident in what I'm talking about. So anyway, that is one of the controls. So people can't just go in and stack them up, saying that, yeah, if you have a large piece of land, you can put in more than one 7,500 or 10,000 gallon a day septic system, whatever that threshold is. This is one of the controls on stopping the, we'll call it unlimited or unregulated placement of these large systems. And note too, that under 3, I forgot to say, that assessment would be required if multiple smaller, and that means including less than 2,000 gallons a day, up to 7,500 gallons per day system are installed on a single property. So what you're doing is you're eliminating the ability to do a let's say a single family housing condominium complex with 100 houses, 200 houses. And they say, well, hey, all of these septic systems are 450 gallon a day septic systems. And we don't need to do a nitrogen analysis. No, you're caught in that. We're going to stop those kind of games. And then jumping down to number 5, we're also going to say that no matter what your nitrogen analysis says, you're still going to be limited to 1,635 gallons per acre of, and this would be, I'm sorry I didn't write it in here. The per acre means upland area, again, not including wetlands and water courses. This eliminates somebody from trying to say, well, hey, you know what? I've got a 5-acre site, but I can buy 50 acres of wetland from my neighbor for nothing. And now I get all of this dilution area. No, and you don't get credit for it in terms of how many gallons per acre you get to put on your property. So we're controlling it. Next one up, bottom elevation of any of the large, subsurface sewage disposal systems. That's number 6. Exceeding 7,500 gallons would be 3 feet above seasonal high water table. Now, the rationale for that, let me throw this out there. We all know that unsaturated conditions directly underneath the leach field are the favorable location for nitrification of the effluent and removal of the various pathogens. Dave's done some sand studies where they know that at 6 inches, you get a lot of removal, 6 inches to a foot.
Well,
It's just enough.
I can cover what we know on that.
All right.
Well,
Anyway,
we can answer your questions.
Okay, but anyway, bottom line is, and I probably shouldn't have injected that yet. Bottom line is, if we look at the MLSS model, and I'm going to just circle back for a minute and say that one of the premises behind everything that I'm saying here is that the public health code, if a septic system is designed, installed, and maintained in accordance with the public health code, it protects the public health and environment. That statement has to be true, or people should have been raising their hands years ago and yelling, my God, this is the end of the world. So I'm operating on that premise. But with the MLSS, if you look at the model, the MLSS makes certain assumptions, and the biggest assumption it makes is at the bottom, at a minimum, the bottom of the leach field is 18 inches above the observed seasonal high groundwater table as defined in the technical standards and so forth. So the MLSS is effectively saying, if you comply with our MLSS regulations, the maximum mound will be less than 18 inches. Now, that I'm not saying it's good that maybe they come up to the bottom of the system, and I'm not saying that it does say that either, but what I'm saying is it's telling you that it's less than that. Within, if you push up on these big ones another 18 inches, you've then got a bare minimum of 18 inches of unsaturated material underneath the bottom of the leach field. Again, I go back to MLSS is a simplified two-dimensional model. It is obviously most effective or applicable on a hillside of some type. We do apply it as a three-dimensional model simply by doubling up when we're on a flat water table site, because there is a recognition that on flat water table sites, we do have radial flow, and there isn't really a quick way to do that. But anyway, that is the thinking on that. The fees, I mean, we talked about that before. It just didn't make sense. If we're gonna, open this up a little bit and say, we're gonna try to move people through here more rapidly to achieve our goal of getting to the finish line with these developments, it may be that more people are going to be needed at DPH. And it also, funding is always one of the big questions, but it also doesn't seem fair that a guy who makes an application for 7,500 gallons pays $625, but the guy that makes application for 7,501 pays a little, it's somewhere in the 4,500 or 5,000 range. Audra can probably clarify that later, but that's the basic application fee. I see no reason why it shouldn't be at least, if not the same, at least based on some pro rata of a gallon per day design flow basis, based on the numbers that people are paying deep now. That seems very fair. But it also moves the DPH, or at least the general fund, in a solvent direction with respect to monies that are required and potentially for training. So having said all that, I probably already talked too long.
You got two minutes left, Stu.
I do. No, I'm good. Let's just, everybody go ahead. We're gonna have lots of question and answer here.
All right, Audra, is your hand up?
Do you want to talk?
So I guess I have a couple of concerns, and I just want to say out loud for the group here. So one, this is a very different structure and format than how the other groups are run, that I've sat on. And so the assignment was for us to evaluate Stu's recommendation, and then we'd have discussion about that. And then that is what we've done. Stu's recommendation did not include an economic evaluation. So I hear what you're saying, which is helpful for this discussion here today, but we've not had a chance to evaluate that and make a recommendation based on the prices that you're throwing out there. And I know it's based on your experience because you've done this for a very long time. So I'm not doubting those. I'm just saying we haven't had a chance to evaluate those because they're not anywhere in writing for us to do that with the evaluation. It sounds like there needs to be clarification to what you put down on paper for us to go back and see if that all makes sense. I think part of the concern here, right, I hear people talking about timing of getting a permit, right, which is one thing. Then we have the cost of building and protecting the environment. Those things are all very much interrelated, right? So the timing to get something through the door is more resources, right? And more of a cookie cutter type process. So maybe one of the things that we can look at is developing a cookie cutter type desktop evaluation for DPH to be able to do, right? That's what they need. They need to be able to quickly evaluate these to get them through the door. And that will speed up the process, right? Even if you only increase resources, say 20%, that would make a huge difference, right? And so that is something that I think should be coming out of this group, is a desktop analysis for people to kind of plug and chug And then we can really understand what those numbers look like. Right? And that way we're really understanding the variables where they're coming from. I heard you talk about, bacteria and the 6-inch zones. There's, federal and there's a lot of guidance out there that has already existed and I've already provided via email on the development of these systems. It's not like we're recreating the wheel there, right? We know that there has to be a minimum separation distance. We know what most of these variables need to be. So I guess I am a little
But the only
concerned.
thing I would say, Audra, is science changes.
I
and-
agree.
And
I agree.
I think there's up-to-date science that should be considered. George referenced some of it,
So
but
can I finish?
certainly.
Okay, so I agree, up-to-date science should be considered. Up-to-date Supreme Court ruling should be considered about discharges to ground and potential breakout. Hydraulic connectivity needs to be considered. What I haven't seen this group do is put together those pieces, right? And so one of the things that I have already submitted, right, was a summary of all of the recent last decade or so of updated regulations and information at a national scale of where people are headed, including updated information about bacteria and viruses and what that needs to look like. EPA's got an entire force of, folks who do this routinely to put out publications, and those haven't been discussed yet of how they fit into this mold.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts? Sonia?
Hello, everyone. How you doing? Actually, it's not a thought directly related to this, but kind of what's going on in general. One of the things I think we've seen in all three of these subgroups is that there are some issues going on with the way that we handle septic systems. We have 2 different state agencies and local health that we're dealing with all this. One of my thoughts was, and I know this is just a random thought, why can't both state agencies be, or both groups be in one agency? Meaning the jurisdiction thing we're talking about, we are talking about large systems, we're talking about small systems, we're talking about dividing them up. Still, I actually deal with what you're talking about a lot, different LLCs. My concern is that we go forward, we establish all this stuff going right now based on this current science, right? But we know science changes. We know the stuff is going to change. We know technology is going to change. And I just want to make sure that these are some pretty intense conversations that some of them may not get figured out before we have to do this report, right? So I keep on backing up the whole, we really need to have a firm infrastructure to handle these types of serious concerns going forward. Lots are not created equally. We should be way more careful in areas that we've been talking about, environmentally sensitive areas versus ones that we're not. And so I just wanted to kind of state that out there because I see it's a struggle, not even just in this particular group, and all of the groups. If we don't have a seat at the table, if there isn't funding allocated, then we're going to be back at the same position that we were in 2007 and 2017. And you guys know what I'm saying. We've been talking about trying to get an AT program going. And one thing I'm very concerned about is if we do all this and everything's straightened out and we're going forward, we still have to deal with AT and we still don't have enough staffing and enough technical knowledge and enough stakeholders that are very, very much stakeholders, I shouldn't say stakeholders, but subject matter experts, involved. We're going to be back in this situation again. And I just want to state that.
Can we hold the general, can we get through specific answers to Stu's proposal? I agree with you 100%, and hopefully you guys are working on a lot of that policy issues on the other groups. But I mean, we have a proposal that Stu took. I know Audra said, why don't we have all sorts of other details on it? Well, I mean, we're trying to come up with ideas, I think, in general in this group. And the ideas are, how do we help with the cost of housing in Connecticut without hurting the environment? And the only one that I guess I understand, and sometimes I'm simple-minded, is Stu's. I know Audra said that she had some in hers. When I look at the purpose of this document, I don't see that. But I mean, anybody else have any thoughts with respect to Stu's details?
So I do want to, right, I want to just emphasize again that the homework assignment, right, for the group was to evaluate what Stu put together.
Yes.
And that's what the department provided.
Thank you.
So he's now just provided additional context to what he put together. And that needs time to be evaluated as well. And so the submittal, right, and it's like a 12, 13-page evaluation that was provided by the department, you seem to just be dismissing.
We haven't gotten to it yet.
Well, you've already stated that you don't see any value in it, right?
No, I have not said that. Don't,
Okay.
I don't want, let me,
No,
let my words be very clear.
Sure.
What I said was Stu appears to be the only individual in this committee that has offered tangible and specific ways that would help with the cost of housing and be protective of the environment. I see how you have critiqued Stu's, how the department has critiqued Stu's proposal. I understand that, and we'll discuss that. But does anybody else in this committee see it any differently? Am I missing another proposal from somebody else that accomplishes suggested ways to reduce costs and help protect but be protective of the environment?
Again, I'm concerned that there was no
Anybody-
cost
Audra,
evaluation
Audra,
in
any-
Stu's. No, there was
I
no cost
understand,
evaluation
Audra,
there.
I understand your perspective. I'm asking if there's anybody else on this committee who feels there has been another proposal put forth that helps consider the cost of housing, yet be protective of the environment.
David, I mean, it might be, if Audra would like, if at this point, it might be appropriate for her to maybe highlight some of the areas in the deep document.
I agree, Jim. I just want to make sure that we're done with Stu's, and that if there's another proposal out there, we should be considering that as well, because I'm not seeing it.
Well, I know that Mark and you know, I think it was Greg both offered some feedback on the proposal, and it probably would be worthwhile for the record for them to kind of maybe summarize what their thoughts pertaining to Stu's proposal are. So I don't know if you'd like to give Mark the floor and then Greg.
Certainly. You there, Mark?
I am here. Sorry, I'm late.
Good morning.
Good morning. Sorry, I'm late.
Did you hear me, Mark, before?
No, I did not.
Oh, okay.
No, I did not.
I'm just gonna throw out just, if you're gonna discuss your comments, your biggest paragraph, I'll call it the first primary paragraph, talked about nitrogen, and I think what I had explained with respect to the nitrogen model I was suggesting is that it would not be the same one that was proposed last spring. It would have specific runoff or infiltrative coefficients assigned to it. So guys like you and I in a development would always do a stormwater management plan. You're gonna have you're gonna have runoff calculations that you're gonna submit. So you're gonna know what all the surfaces are. And the developer or the developer's engineer would then take those infiltrative coefficients and apply them in upland areas only, no wetland, no water courses. So there's none of that kind of gamesmanship. Also, notice the 2,000 gallon a day, under 2,000 gallon a day systems. You can't go in and build 100 small houses and put in a bunch of little systems and say, well, I'm exempt from the nitrogen numbers. You're not going to get around it that way. And so they're going to have to do something which is going to be an in-betweener between the DEP, between using that nomograph or one of the other methodologies, but they're going to have to come up with a composite infiltrative ratio that they're going to be able to use, not just 0.6 and not something else. So pavement gets a 0 unless they infiltrate somewhere else, right? Grass and woods, we come up with a number. Anyway, I wanted to point that out because a big part of that paragraph wasn't the concern about, the model and how it didn't come close to what DEP is doing. So go ahead. I'm sorry, but just.
No, that's quite all right. Listen, I have my concerns is that part of it is still becoming somewhat prescriptive, kind of a hybrid between what DEP has and what DPH has. And all of this, as you get into this, it becomes greater in terms of its science in how you do it. And my fear always is that if you're going to put this and rest this on DPH, they, as a technical aspect of it, and this may be something that occurs later, but it can't occur now because there's just not the manpower, the resources, the knowledge, or the technical capacity of these agencies to be able to handle this, regardless of the, how you can put it in prescriptive or whatever. So this really, and if we're talking about nitrogen and that sort of thing, this forum right now is not ready to do the things that you're talking about. It may be something that is in terms of future, in terms of looking at it, where there's more time to be able to do it and actually have the resources to do it, then that could be a model going forward. But we're talking about now. We're talking about trying to get through this forum now. So there's something that's going to be representative. And I get it. In terms of housing and trying to reduce the cost of housing, I'm all for it because I can see that it's very difficult, even in Connecticut, to get housing that's affordable. But that's also based on on the economic side. It's also driven, and I hate to say it's driven from where the regulators are. For me, I find it that from a DPH, you got the number of folks that are there. I will say that I find Matt and his group pretty responsive to getting information and approvals out there based on what they have and work with. When you get into the most complicated areas, that's where the stopgap is going to come because you're going to be asking for people within a kind of a prescriptive area and people that don't have the technical capacity to do this to start working on these more complicated systems, even on nitrogen reduction, even on how you can't just say this is an infiltration rate, this is an infiltration rate, because even through the concept of a development, watersheds change. There's a lot of information that you have to collect in order, even in some sort of model, to be able to provide those infiltrated rates. So you're asking for a very high science-oriented approach and applying it to DPH in order for reduction of housing costs. Well, that model ain't going to work because first and foremost, Connecticut's not even set up for it. So, I get it, but in the real world, I mean, it's going to be very difficult for this to be, modeled as a regulatory approval process when the state doesn't even have the capacity to handle what it's got now. So I think it's something that you can look down the road, and it's something we should be considering down the road. But as we are right now, for what we're being charged with right now, it can't be done. It just can't be done.
So Mark, what is your perspective the same for what Matt and the Department of Health proposed last fall or last winter? Or why would that differ? If not,
it's and even I mean, when you start going to bigger systems, and I think there is a reality here too. When you're dealing with a single homeowner, that's really a small element that you're dealing with in terms of whether there needs a repair or something happens. Those are individual units. As you start increasing, and I see it, when you start increasing the size of systems and you've got multiple facets of people that are in that forum for discharging to a system, there will be some people that'll be good stewards and there's other ones that will not. And we're not there to be able to ask DPH to be able to monitor systems like that. And again, part of the programming is as you're moving forward is that enforcement and those data points have to be part of the solution. But we're not there right now. And if we're trying to get something on the table to give, and even at 10,000 gallons, to me, that's a big deal. That's a big deal for any development. to be able to get to that point. When you think only, 5, 6 years ago or whatever, we were at 5,000. So in this time, we've doubled it, asking DPH to look at larger systems, to provide more affordability. But even that, I can tell you that just the cost, maybe if you've got sand and gravel systems and that sort of thing, you can probably get the least amount of cost to actually build these. But I'm doing a system right now, 7,200 gallons a day. That system is costing us, with pump stations and everything else, $850,000. Okay? So prorate that against what it's going to be appraised to a unit. And if that's a unit, and let's just say that is, 40 units to get to that number. Okay? Divide 40 units into $850,000. That's what the cost is. It's going to cost you. And I'm just going to give you a
The same
number.
as any on-site system.
That's an
20
on-site
grand a
system.
piece.
And that's in soils that aren't bad. We have slope, that sort of thing. But it is because of the way it's being done that it's cost, the way it is.
Right.
850,000 divided by 40 units.
21,000 a piece.
That's $21,000 a piece. That's kind of the normal of a decent system that you would have for an original system. Okay. Now, that's where it's going to go. That's where it's going to go. So I don't, but they're big. This is taking up acres and acres of land. It's not small.
Well,
So,
so Mark,
Yeah.
here's the question, and this is my original premise. I agree that it's all site specific, and that many times the DEP systems are not necessarily more expensive than the DPH systems, and it may even flip flop. But let me ask you,
Yeah.
you weren't here for this. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
that's
Do you have
okay.
somebody working on your project yet that you applied for in April?
Yeah.
Is there a DP, is somebody at Deep been assigned to it?
No. To your point, that is a
Okay.
problem. That
So,
is a problem.
okay, then here's what I said. I'm gonna say that if you compare the cost of systems, Deep and DPH, there is a range. They could be up or down either way, and that's up to the designer to try and advise his client which way to go. However, on Monday, the governor signed a bill and they're pushing for more housing. They say there's a housing crisis. They need houses now.
Yeah.
You made applications 6 months ago. You don't have anybody working on it yet. You're going to be 18 months out before you get a tentative determination / public notice.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody is building your project, your 40 condo project, how much is that? $20 million project or more total?
A 40.
You
40
just said
units?
you had 40 units, 70.
Oh no, that 40 units was under DPH. This
But I'm
system
saying,
is
how much is the total project cost? Is it $20 million project, $40 million project, you think?
I don't know the whole numbers on that.
Okay, well, anyway, I was using the analogy of if you looked at a big development, that would be somewhere around a 10,000 gallon number. And it doesn't matter who's building it, but you're building it in a range of 830 Gs and other median income
Right.
houses.
Yep.
You'll be talking 40 million, 50 million, something like that. $400,000 a unit is probably the target for what they would be spending. The developer on day one has got to arrange for some form of financing, usually 20–25%. He's got to either do it out of pocket from investors or from a bank.
Oh, yeah.
Time and use of money, $10 million, 18 months is over $1 million. You just pissed away waiting for DEP. I'm
Right.
sorry, but that's the nice way of putting it.
All right, Stu and Mark. How about Greg? Got anything to share? Or if not, that's fine too.
Matt Pollock is here too, just he looks like he joined.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna go Greg and then we're gonna go Matt. And
So
then
I
we'll
brought this
go
to our
whoever next
staff.
First had their hand up.
So I brought this to our staff. We generally agree with Stu's proposal. We like stuff that's simple, straightforward, hopefully effective. We could study this for the next 10 years, never arrive at an answer. I'm of the opinion that we're under time constraints to come up with a solution, something now that we can act upon that's very pointed. And Stu's, yes, that is the only proposal I've seen and we've reviewed at this point. So let's move forward with something. We have to move forward with something, and it's got to be simple. Where staff, things have become very complicated with dividing properties, and the system we have right now is not working. People are avoiding two state agencies, DEP and DPH. I have proposals in Old Saybrook now where they're dividing up the septic systems, multiple systems on a lot, avoiding DPH drinking water section as well through drilling multiple wells to serve apartment buildings. So there's this huge avoidance. Let's come up with a solution. Stu, yours is the only one I've heard that seems to somewhat make sense to move us forward.
Well, I guess I'll just throw out the one other question. If nobody likes,
let's,
no, I was just gonna say, if nobody else wants to do what I'm thinking, I guess, what would we propose? Just something.
we're gonna do that after we get through the next. All right, Matt, you have any thoughts?
Well, first of all, my apologies for not coming on time. I had something come up, so sorry for that. But I'll be brief.
Thanks for making it.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm kind of with Mark and Audra. Read both of their responses. I think in general, though, if I were to just summarize everything, I think this is an issue that is just too big for this committee to deal with in the time constraints that we have. I'm not saying it's not something important. I just don't think that it's realistic to tackle this issue in this time frame. So so my recommendation, if I were to look at this, I would say look at what DPH has proposed, and massage, tweak, whatever, what we already put on there. And because that's the only way that this thing is going to get passed and by 2026. If you go and you start taking on these massive changes, it's not going to happen. And there's a lot of people out there that were waiting for last year for this thing to pass. And in my personal opinion, I thought this was a huge, if you really look at it, a huge gimme to the home builders. I mean, you know, the 10,000 gallons now, and then with that Mickey Mouse nitrogen formula, I recognize that, guys. That was so non-conservative. It was a huge giveaway. And so I that's why I was rather stunned that people were pushing back on that. Like, that was so minimal. And the only time you don't have to use that is if you were in these coastal areas. And I think everybody can recognize that. Or what we deemed as other nitrogen sensitive areas, and we came up with that actually in conjunction with one of the DEEP's agencies, this wetland setback. But so what I could just see perhaps I'll give you an example of what I think could be a change, a tweak that somebody had mentioned about the public water supply watershed. So in lieu of, let's say, inland areas, with this wetland thing, that perhaps that would be a different approach. Honestly, though, I think that might be more conservative, because there's a heck of a lot of land across the state on these public water supply watersheds versus these wetland setbacks. Because typically when you're building on these properties, you avoid those anyway, because you just don't want to deal with those. So and that was, by the way, how we structured it. You could have wetland areas on your property as long as you kept your system outside of those areas. You were not going to be subject to the more stringent nitrogen. So that's my 2 cents. And I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you. Who was first, Sonia or Audra? The hand.
I actually just have a question about the proposal now. You mentioned stormwater a lot in what you're going through, and I apologize, I wasn't able to read in detail everything that was written out. One of the questions I had is because under local health, we deal with the stormwater, but we don't deal with the stormwater. We make sure it's far enough away from our system. If there's an issue, we can require a mounding analysis, that kind of thing. But as far as what it sounds like, we might be a little more involved if we were to do this process. Am I incorrect? When you were talking about infiltration surfaces, would we now be part of the actual process of stormwater, which, by the way, leans heavily into a septic world? As you guys know, it's part of one of our big things in the puzzle that we're looking at. So I was just curious on how this would have gone to stormwater and health.
The one that I was talking about, Sonia?
Yep.
Well, I think I'm gonna say, many of you have seen plans that come out of my office, and we usually have a design criteria somewhere on the plan that enumerates the various components that are required for the design. Usually it starts out with a statement of, here's the proposal, then it's the design percolation rate, then it's the proposed effective leaching area, the septic tank sizing, pump chamber sizing, and so forth. Then there's the MLSS is considered, there's usually a statement about that. I would say, I can see it on our plan right now, simply saying nitrogen assessment. And it's gonna say total buildable or upland area, I don't know, 22 acres. Total, and it would actually be in square feet, but I'm gonna use acres for the analogy. We would say, 22 acres. 2 acres of pavement, infiltrative coefficient, 0. 10 acres of grass, infiltrative coefficient, whatever we pick, 0.5, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, pick a number. And you would have that right in your, that would be in the technical standards. And then wooded areas, infiltrative rate, 0.6, 0.7, whatever the number is. And then you simply do a weighted average of them. And there's the number that you use for a site-wide number. Instead of 0.6, as Matt said, his calculations were very simplified. The 0.6 harkens back to the original DEP manual where, it was in there, but it was understood that you would modify that based on site constraints. This is very close. My vision of this is very close to what Randy May and Kent Healy wrote 40 years ago. Okay? That was since modified by Nate's office 20 years ago, when they came up with what's currently, but the basic idea, dilution is a solution of pollution, is still the model for nitrogen. So anyway, that's kind of it. So it's pretty simplified. We're not trying to make it difficult. Mark is correct that if you expect sanitarians to go through a drainage report and tear the whole thing apart and figure it out, that's a pain in the butt that nobody's going to want to do. I see it as very simplified if there is a table in the technical standards that says, here's the way we're going to do it. And you're going to figure out your pavement, your grass, your woods. Maybe there's another one, I don't know. But you add those. And the designer is going to have to do that drainage report anyway. He's going to have a stormwater management plan, and he's going to be telling the town and the town engineer and everybody that ahead of time. So that info's right there at his fingertips.
If I can, Dave, I'm just going to
Good, Sonia. Well, let's go to Audra and then Mark, and
I'll have something to say about
we
that.
probably also need to try to leave about an hour to figure out where we want to go because
Yeah.
we're going to try to go over the DEP feedback and now figure out where we want to go in very short order. So Audra.
So I'm going to circle back a little bit before some of this discussion, but I do have questions about what we just talked about. Again, I hear timing is an issue, right? I hear that money is being spent with applications sitting, right, potentially on my desk, right, that aren't assigned to people. And that is costly. So when we think about savings and costs to these projects, we get back to resources. And currently I can tell you that there are one senior staff person here at DEEP, right? And I've talked about before in other groups where we are required to triage failing systems and repairs over new projects. Now that's different than what we do in some of our other programs here at the agency, but we have more staff to accommodate that. So if there is resources, right, the funding component that goes along with, right, we can set up pathways, right, you call them like fast track, where you can have staff who just work on new projects, right, and you have staff who are just working on repairs as they come in, because right now it sounds like to me we're putting them both at the same level of priority, right, and they can't be based on the resource that currently exists in the program. Right. So as we're training young professionals who come into the group, it takes time to get them on board. And so we really need to be thinking about, in addition to, right, trying to make this cookie cutter process work, It is how we're going to make sure those projects, once you have a cookie cutter, whether it's deep or DPH, are getting through with the resources that exist. Right. And I think that just goes back to, this is a much bigger challenge than just modifying some calculations.
Well, I think you're gonna find, we agree with you. We'd like to see you have more people. I think Mark will agree. We like the people you have. They're very good and they're very responsive when they can get to it. But you know,
Right.
you are understaffed. It's a simple fact. I'm not trying to, as I said early on, I'm not trying to point fingers. I'm simply saying that's the fact. And
100%. Yeah.
DEP's process, as you said, maybe there's a way to streamline it. Don't take it the wrong way. It's
Oh,
before
no,
your
not at
time,
all.
but I've heard this before. There's been attempts within DEP to streamline the process, and it always goes the other way. I'm sorry, but bureaucracy builds on bureaucracy. I'm sorry, it's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
It's just the beast. So, anyway, again, I look at it that maybe it's simply because it's convenient, but Matt is just sitting out there waiting for more projects. I can tell he has nothing to do and he's hoping I'll send him some more. But seriously, we're on board with it. I think part of our recommendations can be, look, everybody needs more people. Everybody needs more people. The state is now committed to more housing. Remember, we've just seen a 180-degree flip-flop in the direction of development in this state. This state was, hey, conserve every square inch of property in the state, don't build on it. And now suddenly we need 10,000 houses in the next year. Is that the number I heard? I'm almost positive somebody said that at that meeting. 10,000? How are you going to do that? But anyway, the point is, when they start throwing those kinds of numbers around, that's a sea change in the thought processes of, building in this state. And the easiest avenue to move things forward, get them built and save a little bit of money along the way, is going through DPH. And I think, I look at this, we're not rocking the boat too awfully much. Yes, everybody's thinking that removing the lot line shift, the lot line is a big deal. But heck, the lot line right now is a pain in the butt because everybody's doing it anyway. We end up putting them there.
That's where I see it. So
yeah. So, and I mean, I think that's right. That's one of the challenges, right? The lot line, when you go back through some of the analysis, it is kind of the only thing that is helping to determine jurisdiction between the two agencies, right? So what Sonia said earlier was, we're trying to create a fast track in DPH because deep is slow, right? But deep doesn't have to be slow. If both agencies have more resources, right, there are ways to do this so you don't have to mess around with the science too much. There really are, and it's happened in other states. I've been part of it, where general permits, right, they get created and there is design criteria that goes along with it, right? Within that structure and that format, that's where some of the science comes out, right? That's where we say, if you're going to build and it's going to look like this, then you're good to go. And it's a very fast process, but you still need resources to get to that point, right? You need people like yourselves and us at the table to come up with that process. And then you still need people to process that, right? So I hear the state that wants to move, and we don't want to hold that up in any way, shape, or form. We want to move with you. It doesn't look good for me. Doesn't make my staff feel good, right? But we have to really take some steps back here to think about how is that going to work for the long term, short term and long term, right? I think there's two pathways.
yeah, and the reality is we just don't have, we didn't have enough time really to do what we were assigned, but the reason I'm supportive of Stu's, I'll say, effort to try to find a mechanism. He was the only one that really put in a huge effort to try to lay out very detailed ideas on what might work. And, I still, as somebody that's worked in the field of, soil science and groundwater science my whole past 38 years, I am at a loss how a lot line changes the environmental factors. If I'm a developer, I could take my property, chop it into 3 lots and do exactly what everybody's saying. Oh my God, all these complications and all these sites. I get it. 100% get it. But the reality is that's what they do today. So what Stu offered to me was something that recognized that reality and said, look, here's something that we might be able to do. I completely get why people, especially regulatory agencies, are opposed to it. But it's the tension that has to exist here. And ultimately, I think at this point, we're gonna have to figure out, is there anything that we as a group can do to try to help with these costs going forward? And let's say we have an hour left now. I don't know if everybody wants to shift the focus to that. I mean, we can go over Audra's feedback. You know, I think I would just say, Audra, the science is always changing. You know, nothing's a constant. I can share with the department data that is absolutely recognized scientifically, that's been peer reviewed at the highest levels. And you're going to find in 6 inches of a C33 sand, you're going to see 50% nitrification in the coldest temperatures.
So what about bacteria, right?
Well,
So-
let me finish.
So we can't think about them just in one avenue.
Excuse me, I listened to you for a while. So with 6 inches, you're going to find 50% nitrification. When you go to 12 inches, what you're going to find is 90 to 100% nitrification. And we're going to find at 18 inches is 100%, right? You're going to see roughly 20 to 30% denite in that same space. Bacteria, there's some very good studies that have recently been done, I think, for the EPA at the Mass Test Center. And absolutely, we should consider all that. I think it'll be fairly eye-opening from the way we perceive it. So my point is, we need to consider the science. I don't really know that we have time to do that at this point. So, you know, I think your points, we appreciate the department's feedback to Stu's proposal. I don't know what everybody else in the group thinks, but if we're going to try to come up with something for the legislature to be helpful, we got an hour. I mean, what's our timeline, Jim, for this whole process? Aren't we done in December? Isn't this just, we're about done?
Yeah, so I think the goal obviously is to have a report drafted by the entire working group, you know, sometime in the middle of January, that can then be fine-tuned and ready to be submitted on February 1st. If I could just ask real quick, I think, you know, there's obviously some consensus here on staffing and resources for the state agencies. And I think, you know, Stu laid out and Audra, you know, also concurred, was that time is money. And, you know, I know that for certain, representing the Home Builders and Remodelers Association. So I would just ask, I'm curious, Audra, if conversations have been had in other subcommittees about specifically what an idealized resourced deep would look like, right? Do we know how many FTEs we're talking about and what kind of resources? Has that been outlined anywhere?
So it hasn't been outlined. It has been discussed. And I think some of it gets back to, you know, like I could probably back of the envelope put together like how many resources would it take under, you know, the proposal as it is today. But then there's the DPH side of the house for resources. And that world is not created evenly. So I don't want to talk for Matt and Sonia, but the discussion really has been that you might need more people in this group over here, right, in a town where there's growth than somewhere else, right? So the resource allocation is not going to be the same across the board. And that becomes a real hurdle because you can't just say we're going to give every, you know, every office 10 new people or 2 new people, whatever that number is, right? Because it's not going to be distributed equally. So that is a hurdle for the DPH side of the house. And I don't know if Sonia, Matt, you want to add to that, but.
Oh, I mean, I could say from us, it's not even just septic, I mean, or even environmental factors. I just want to remind something that local health were also the ones that handled the pandemic stuff. So I can tell you in my area that not only were we dealing with that, but we were also dealing with a massive building boom. Everyone home was doing a pool, a deck. You know, I sent so many applications up to DPH, so I know that they probably had a lot going through, as well as a very wet season at one time. And when that happens, we do have to shift our responsibilities. So, you know, if we don't have some dedicated funding straight to septic, I do think that's not just going to state DPH level, but it's also local health level. And I wanted to bring up one thing that Greg said, and he's very spot on with this. They don't just try to avoid DEP, it's also DPH. So us in local, yeah, when we have these large communities, we're getting hammered. I do them all the time. I'm the one who gets all of them. So I get 3 systems at 1,800 gallons per day or whatever. Whatever doesn't have to go to Matt, you're welcome. Whatever doesn't have to go to Antonella, you're welcome. But that means now there's 3 different systems that we have to, Greg or and myself, Jim, whatever, have to review. So I just wanted to lay that one out there. Matt?
So is there, the other thing that we've kind of keyed in on was, and Sonia brought this up multiple times, is that different groups started, I'm going to say interfering, maybe that's not the right word for it, but engaging in this process of wastewater decisions in the state. Is there consensus? I think there might have been that there should be some level where the DEP, DPH, I'll say has maybe ultimate authority with respect to wastewater decisions in the state. As I don't know if that's the right language, but I'll throw that out there. What does the group think on that?
I don't know if I understand I don't know if I understand what you're
Do
saying.
you want to explain, Sonia, your perspective?
What am I missing?
Sonia, I think you've been the one that's brought it up as much as anyone.
Yes. So we are in the land use department and we're still often stuck in the middle, which is the reason why I asked about the stormwater, and I'll get into that. So right now we have, planning and zoning, and they have something that kind of, I want to just say, skates through with affordable housing. But we also have inland wetlands. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but we are getting stuck in the middle. Sometimes with DPH criteria, it's not stringent enough, especially when you're in an area down here on the shoreline, which we have issues. I can attest to a system that I reviewed with Matt like a year or 2 ago. And then you have other situations where it could be easily done, then we have the 8 commissions reviewing it, and they're reviewing it for inland wetlands is going to be reviewing it more for environmental protection, right? But then we get stuck in the middle because there's a third-party environmental engineer that's going to be reviewing our approval. And what we're doing is based on whatever was in the technical standards. So we get stuck in the middle with that. And it doesn't seem to be consistent throughout the state. So every commission, and I don't know anything about them, so I'm not trying to diss anyone or anything like that, but I've come from areas where you could go straight through, no one's going to say a word, to one that needs 2 milligrams per deciliter of nitrogen, next to a transfer station. It just seems to be a very big range, which developers, how are you supposed to budget for that when you go into a town? Are you supposed to know what the commissions want? And in our world, it's very prescriptive, it's regulatory. So we do have things that we are doing on, and then those things are getting challenged, and it's not our decisions, it's actually whatever DPH or DEP has put in the regulations and technical standards. The stormwater part. So I don't want to get stuck in the middle about septic. I certainly don't want to get stuck in the middle with stormwater. And stormwater right now, and that is another thing that can be different. And some towns it's your town engineer, and some towns it's zoning, and some towns it's both. And the one thing that we definitely need to know with a septic system is to make sure that we know where the stormwater is, because it could potentially impact the system. So there are these other things that are going on, and it's not even just septic and stormwater. We also deal with water treatment, wastewater disposal systems, and private wells. So there's a lot that could be that's communicate at a local level in various commissions, design standards. No, we want a house over here. You really can't do that because there's a septic system there. So there's a lot going on at the local level. And one thing that I think that would be really helpful is, yes, defining those paths. This is a regulatory health department. We're not talking about environmental protection. We're talking about what we have in the technical standards that we have. It's very prescriptive. Go down the line. This is what it is. Versus trying to defend ourselves to engineers that are saying that it's going to be harmful to the environment. Well, I'm not saying it isn't or it isn't. I'm just saying that this is what we are allowed to approve per the health code. That's my piece.
Okay, that's helpful.
So is that something this group thinks we should make a recommendation on?
Are you thinking of recommendation on trying to, I don't know why I use the word mandate, but trying to figure out how to come up with a system that takes a little bit of burden off DPH, right?
Well, yeah, I think that I think the issue is a developer goes in, and this is the same economic issue we discussed with the bigger the agency that you go to, the more complicated it is. That's why everybody goes to the sanitarians, right? Call a spade a spade. So the more we can streamline this process. And if the wetlands group has a concern over the nitrogen, that should really be a concern that's addressed at the wastewater level, not further downstream.
Well,
So
well,
what I'll
hold on,
add to
here's-
that is that there are, so under the Long Island Sound TMDL, right? So it's the dissolved oxygen TMDL has been in place for like ever and ever. Towns were set up by zones, and they are required to reduce nitrogen, right? So we all sat through, some of us sat through, right, the discussion and presentation last week by USGS and then DEEP about, you know, nitrogen and sources of nitrogen and groundwater and it, you know, showing up later on and all those things. And so it is a complicated issue when it comes to that because the state's not, you know, it's not a one size fits all. There are certain areas that you need to be more concerned about with nitrogen than others. So I don't think a recommendation, and I want to make sure I'm understanding, I don't think the recommendation can be like the Inland Wetlands Commissions all need to agree that this is going to be the standard. That's not going to work statewide because the state is unique and different, and they have other factors, right, that are mandating them to reduce certain influences of pollutants around the state.
But
Well,
presumably in the nitrogen sensitive areas, that concept, that would be factored in. And if we take that approach, why wouldn't that be part and parcel to it?
Hold it. One other thing, let me just inject here, and I've been unfortunately sat in front of many inland wetland commissions for a lot of reasons. I think right now we're looking at it from a new development perspective. One thing that I think we'll all agree is a no-brainer is that we should recommend that for repair, Sonia shouldn't have to go to the Wetland Commission. If you're not increasing the flow, not increasing, you know, not doing the so-called change in use, something that falls under the B100A regulations, the Inland Wetland Commission shouldn't be getting in the middle of that.
That stays on the same
What else
footprint.
you gonna do? As long as she can confidently say this complies with the public health code, because we know we're not gonna throw people off their property.
Right.
So I think you want to differentiate repair from new. New, yes, there's a universe out there of things, and I don't know how you would do that unless you wanted to try and apply, say for single family, say, well, if you meet the nitrogen regulations per acre or whatever, that's your nitrogen analysis. I don't know, but I'm just saying for repairs, I think Sonia shouldn't have to, and Greg shouldn't have to be in here in the Wetland Commission begging for permission.
Can
When they
I,
do-
And it takes months for a repair, so.
When they do the repair, it stays in the footprint generally, or does it move around the property?
Here's the thing, it does move around the property. I know Jim wants to say something to it at some point, Audra. But what I do want to say is that when you have a system, and you have a 2-bedroom system, say, you're going to have to repair your system. And guess what? Unfortunately, there are built up inland wetlands and tidal wetlands. And guess what? You can also get, that's the way it is. You can get your septic system back. We can't just start shoving people off of their properties. So in one area, you'll have to go through an Inland Wetlands Commission for a tank replacement. And I ask you, how or why would that be the case? Because anything they do could actually make it worse. Meaning, we're talking about a certain set elevation going in, a certain cell elevation going out, and only one location to put it. Having someone who have to wait a couple months in some towns, and again, everything's different. Okay. Even the leaching system, as Dave and do you know this, we have areas that are just built on wetlands. I wish it wasn't the case. I'm sure Greg wishes it wasn't the case. And Greg's boss had like the best saying ever. It was like, we're trying to jam all this sewage in a very, very small area sometimes. But guess what? It's already had 4 bedrooms. It gets to have 4 bedrooms again. And now we have to do a lot more different because now we are allowed to ask for variances all over the code, right? And we work hand in hand with DPH. I've had some zingers, and Matt knows that. And it can be very difficult. Right now, I have someone trying to appeal a perfectly normal septic system replacement. Not an order, just a replacement. And you got to remember, neighbors, we get stuck in the neighbor wars, right? That's something we don't want to be part of. We don't want to say, you don't fix your system because my neighbor doesn't want it there. That's some of these things that we're going to get stuck in, and we are getting stuck in. So yes, thank you, Stu, for saying that, because that, as you know, one of my biggest issues. On the shoreline, everything's tear down, rebuild. I mean, not everything, 90%.
so I would just say, short answer, this is a conversation that's probably more applicable to process and funding. But beyond that, I'd like to say that I agree with the concept full-heartedly, right? to me, you know, the idea that a sanitarian local health district, you know, approves the design, the installation, and you know, approves the final, system. I believe, to me, that there's a presumption that they're doing that, following all states' laws and regulations in doing so, right? So, and if that presumption is something that should be applicable, then, you know, there shouldn't be a need to go to inland wetlands afterwards, right? And obviously, time is money, and it just makes sense that the buck should stop with the sanitarian. So, short answer again, I question whether or not we should even be talking about this in this group, or at least, you know, making that recommendation to process and funding to consider doing this. But
I like the idea, Jim, about moving it to Sonia's group. And I think the DEP staff allocation to accelerate the permit time and the streamlined DEP process, right? That, I mean, it's really, we should probably go back, right, to what are we gonna, if that's where we are with it. What are
So
the
what-
other, does anybody have any other ideas how we're going to help with cost and protect the environment?
I think, David, maybe if Audra is interested and willing, if she'd like to point out, you know, the cost saving measures identified in the deep report, that might be a worthwhile conversation to pivot to.
Absolutely.
So what I can start with is we didn't do a cost evaluation as part of this, right? It's similar to Stu's didn't have a cost evaluation with it. What we are basing these updates on are some of the roadblocks that we routinely run into, which cause delays, right? Time is money. And we have to go back and forth and back and forth. That is an exhausting process for everybody involved. And so some of the recommendations that came out of the group were what we consider to be moving the state into a more modern era, while you know, looking at advanced technology in certain areas. And so one of the things that we would like to think about is differentiating zones, right? We have, you know, the coastal area, which is definitely more sensitive, and we know that there is a shorter return or a faster infiltration, right, on the coast, just based on soils and what's going on with Long Island Sound. If you can say anything on the coast has to put in AT, and you got to get to 10 before you get into the ground, then we don't have such a challenge with nitrogen, right? Because we've dealt with the pollution part of it, right, before dilution, and then you're just dealing with hydraulics. Just keep it in the ground, right? Water cannot come out of the ground in any way, shape, or form. Or now you're talking about point source discharges, which is a whole different Clean Water Act issue. And that would get the state in a lot of delegation challenges, like a lot. So if we can think about, you know, putting in regions, right? We know there's certain things going on in different parts of the state. And then you can mandate certain technologies for those, right, for those regions, and say, we know it's going to work here. And then you just have to keep it in the ground, right? And then you don't have to worry about a nitrogen evaluation or nitrogen modeling or any of those things, because we know it's going to attenuate.
So how does that help with the cost perspective?
So the thinking, again, right, we didn't do a cost evaluation. The thinking is right
Or
now.
just in general, not
So it's really just time savings, right? So we go back and forth a lot trying to, you know, in all honesty, most of the land that was developable has been developed. And now we're trying to put things on, you know, virgin land where it wasn't appropriate or suitable before. And now we're like, well, we need to, right? To Stu's point, we're doing this pivot and this changeover in the state where we're saying now, nope, we're no longer so concerned about having all this native land. Let's build. Okay, so now we know that we're building on lands that nobody wanted to build on before because there were challenges. And so if we mandate certain technologies in certain areas, then we don't have to have a back and forth, right? That's part of the streamline process. Then you as a developer know what you got to put in. You as a developer know what it is you're dealing with. And then you can quickly get approvals to move forward, right? So I think there were some numbers thrown out earlier of how much money is it, you know, just having something sit on my desk. before it gets assigned to somebody, right? Doesn't mean we still don't need people to do it, but it does streamline that process significantly. And I personally hate the S word, but you know, it is going to change that process. We have to fundamentally look at some of those challenges, right? Stick in the cookie cutters where they're appropriate. And then there are always going to be areas where cookie cutter is not going to work, right? And then we're in a different world, right? We're on the individual basis. But you could even come up with infiltration rates. You could standardize all of those things, right? But you do have to think about what is going on in the soils in the state, because it is not one size fits all.
Well, so what are you proposing as a nitrogen sensitive area? I saw some of it, you know,
Yeah.
you were discussing the shoreline. I would argue that simply doing it by town or broad region is not an adequate way to do it, because
Sure.
here we are, I
Yep.
live and work in Old Saybrook,
Yep.
and I can tell you where I live in the north part of town is not a
Yep.
problem here. Now, so what are you know, I think we discussed this at our in-person meeting a couple of months ago. I know you weren't here, but
Mhm.
we had an in-person meeting. And we discussed the you know, putting together some kind of a map. Do you have a map that you would propose as your nitrogen sensitive base map?
I don't have a map, you know, at hand. I think one could generally be developed, right, between the information and that the other bureau has at DEEP, and you know, our water quality information and soils maps from USGS. I'm sure a map could be put together, right, that
Yeah.
identifies sensitive areas based on soil. But then there's also the returns, right? So anything around a lake. I know that DEEP on the water quality side is going to propose interpretations of nutrient standards to deal with nitrogen and phosphorus in our lakes, right? So people want to build around the lakes, and we have to think about what that looks like. So I'm sure we can come up with sensitive areas.
Okay, so I'm just thinking in terms of timing.
Yeah.
And, you know, we had discussed somewhere way back that maybe some of what we're gonna do is if we can come up with some concrete proposals for right now, but also some continuation proposals.
Right. Yep.
Now, I might be, from your perspective, looking at this as an opportunity to get into that, because I don't think you can solve the AT question, your map and all this other in the next week or two.
No.
This might be your opportunity if we make a recommendation that here's what we're proposing today, but we also recognize that there's these other things that don't fit in the one size fit all basket. And we need to continue with this and, you know, and work on it, you know, so you can say to the legislature, we're considering this and here's how we're gonna do it.
And
You can have a framework for it. I just don't know, when we're talking in the universe of things that are beyond the scope of the next couple of weeks to get it accomplished, you know, that.
Well,
So,
Audra, along those lines, I would say, you know, we spent a lot of time today discussing how many variables exist out in nature, right? That's why the property line's no good, how heterogeneous the world is. And the one thing that I've learned in doing a lot of groundwater sampling is how variable it is. You know, I've seen areas with nitrogen loads I cannot believe. And I've sampled right where the water tailed out on the Long Island Sound, and it was less than 10. All right. So there's you know, in situ denitrification that occurs. So I think if we're going to set these maps, these broad maps in general, this is no different than us saying, hey, why don't we go with Stu's broad proposal? The answer is no, it's too heterogeneous. All right.
It's not the
And
same.
once, excuse me, on the flip side, when you say, hey, let's go with this broad map proposal, I come back at you and say, hey, it's too heterogeneous. What we really need to allow a town to do is, if you broad brush Old Saybrook into all nitrogen sensitive, we need to allow a town to go down to the Long Island Sound, set wells and monitoring points, just like they do on the Cape, simple monitoring points. What is that actual load to the sound there? And if you find that you have denitrification naturally occurring, I think we have to recognize that.
Well, and I think it goes back to the presentation, right, that we saw last week for USGS. is it's not as simple as I can model this home and right here I'm going to go sample, right? You have nitrogen loads coming down the state into the coast, right?
I get it.
Okay, so I don't think it's as simple as we have to
But
stick in
what
some
the
wells.
unique thing you have where you have salt water, if you have fresh water lighter than salt water and you have salt water, you can find that very spot where the salt water is holding the fresh water up and you can grab samples there.
That sounds
It's a
more
very
complicated
unique
than it's worth.
Well, excuse me?
I said that sounds complicated, right? For
Look,
somebody
it's
to put
way
in.
simpler than a model, right? You go in there and you actually measure it. You can calibrate your models. This is exactly what they've done out on the Cape. So what I'm suggesting to this group is, I think the mapping's fine and the broad mapping's fine. It has exactly the same concerns that you said against Stu are present against the model and against the broad maps. All right? So
I didn't actually propose any.
I'm suggesting, no, I mean, the mapping's been proposed, right? Broad mapping of nitrogen sensitive areas was just proposed, as I understood it. So I'm suggesting there's an allowance within this that would allow actual sampling and determinations to be made by actual data.
I don't disagree that more data is good. I think that if you're gonna include additional sampling, it's going to slow your process down.
Of course, it's something that when they would start with the broad map, right, that says all of Old Saybrook is in a nitrogen sensitive area or everything within 200 feet, whatever it is. But then there'd be an allowance to allow a town to more fine tune that.
But I think that gets into the bureaucratic process that we were trying to avoid, right? You're creating these off roads where now it's not a cookie cutter. Now we have to go down and somebody get a sample. You got to come up with a sampling plan. You got to make sure you collect enough samples. Maybe you need a year's worth of data, right? I want 20 data points to be statistically valid. And now I need to sample year round. So now you're adding time to that project.
I get it, but what you're gonna find is there's areas that have natural denitrification occurring.
I think what Dave's saying is just giving them the choice.
Yes,
If they don't take the choice, they have to stay with the map.
exactly.
But that off ramp is what's gonna cause a roadblock. That's gonna cause a
Well,
roadblock.
no, they
We're
can
back to where
go
we
with the
were.
map though. They can use the map if they want. If they're willing to just go forward with
Right.
whatever the map says. We're just saying, Dave's just saying, give them an off ramp. If they choose to take it, they have to understand money. They're gonna spend time and money, but
So
he's
the-
saying, give them.
Right. Okay. So I hear you. So the off ramp, right, then puts you back into like an individual type permit world. If we think about we're creating a general permit, then you're choosing, right? That's one of the criteria. The cookie cutter is say map, right? General permit, you're smooth sailing, right? Because we're coming up with criteria. If you've got an off ramp somewhere, you're no longer in that world. You're somewhere else.
I think here's how I would see it, Audra, and I may be missing that. But you'd start with a map and the whole shoreline of Old Saybrook within 200 foot is red, all right? Nitrogen sensitive, bad. They go in there and they grab samples along that coastline and they say, hey, look at this area here. I'm less than 10 milligrams per liter flux to the sound. Look at this area here. I'm 40. Look at this area here. You redefine your maps.
I don't think it's going to be that simple. And I think we have to continue to acknowledge that TMDLs exist. Watershed models already exist.
But the
Right.
models aren't simple either, and they're inaccurate.
Agreed. I agree. And so I guess what I'm saying is if you create an off road or an off ramp, it doesn't solve the immediate problem.
I'm just, well, all right,
Yeah.
I made my case. I think actual data should be considered in lieu of theoretical data.
I think, can I give you an example of how something similar to what you're saying, Dave, exists in our code? So when we do soil testing, if we observe modeling, we're going to all assume that's where the high water table is, seasonal high water, and we're going to design around it. But an engineer does have the option to say, you know what, I don't necessarily agree with that. I could go two ways. I could I could build my system now with the modeling, or I can wait monitor through a wet season, and if I find out that the model's
Exactly.
shallower or whatever, I
Yes.
can now design my system on that. So I think
Yeah.
that's kind of what you're saying.
That's exactly what he's saying.
Yeah,
Agreed, Matt.
That's precisely it.
good. And so the only downside to that, and obviously Audra is correct. I mean, obviously the developer has to weigh whether the time is going to be worth it or whatever
For the
versus the
town.
cost. There's also a burden on whoever the reviewing staff is too. That takes a little more time to review something that complex, then, because we're getting into a little more complexity and things like that. But again, I the concept what you're saying, I understand it. I
I'm
understand.
thinking, Matt, it would be more along the lines of the WPCA might choose to more fine tune their map in a town.
So Sonia, I know you have your hand up, and I just want to add that the Supreme Court ruling for the Maui case, right, really lays out that if we're tracing nutrients, we're tracing pollutants from a system into whatever surface water body, you're now a point source discharge. So I guess from where I'm sitting from a regulatory hat is I would not encourage us to be sampling surface water and trying to determine if it's coming from a groundwater, because I think that's going to put the state in a lot of trouble.
It would still be groundwater samples. So, I mean, you can look at the report that was done, I think, in Hawks Nest Beach and get a sense for it. We looked at salinity levels at depth.
I'm just throwing it out there that I think that sets the state up for a pathway they do not want to go down under the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, and I think you're going into the weeds, which that's a good thing to do. But yeah, I get it. Like, in other words, you're saying that, okay, the concept of that is okay, but then when you look at the actual methodology behind it, it's not that clear cut, and it's going to create problems.
Matt, what I would say is it's called model validation.
Okay.
Right? If your model's predicting it's all red and you go there and you sample it and it's not, your model's wrong. All right. I'll be very candid.
Yeah, I think what Audra's saying though is there has to be a methodology that's accepted by everybody of determining that the actual empirical data is acceptable. And I think that might be somewhat challenging, although I'm not an expert on that. It sounds like Audra has a lot more experience in that, which makes sense. She's a deep. So just recognizing that.
This is what they do on Cape Cod, right? They have sentinel monitoring points. So I guess they're going to get in a lot of legal trouble. I'll ask them about that. But
I don't know what they do in Cape Cod. I'm just throwing out here today that would be my concern as a state agency. And what I know about regulatory structures, I don't think it's a pathway that is going to be helpful or fruitful for a developer to put stuff in. It's going to, time is money. It's going to delay the process.
So it might be worthwhile, and I apologize.
This would not be the developer. This would be some other group trying to fine tune the model.
So David, maybe the best thing to do would be to kind of table, of course, let Sonia speak, but to table this conversation, maybe find from the folks at Cape Cod, if you can make a phone call, identify why or how they can circumvent the Clean Water Act.
I don't think that's the call you want to make. I really don't. I don't think they're circumventing anything. I think they're probably doing, because what they're doing is with USGS and EPA. So I'm just putting it out there is that we are not Cape Cod. We have a sound, and it's a little bit different here. The landscape is different. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so I always think about this, how is this going to roll out in the regulatory world, in our world over here? Who's making the decision on whether or not these things needs to be more intensely looked at or not? In other case, where you guys are doing it the opposite way. So right now, we have a problem with that. So if someone were to come in and say, I want to do this project and I have all this data, well, who's going to make that distinguish that they are or they're not allowed to? If you do it at a town level, you're going to have a lot of disparity. You're going to have a lot of differences again, right? If you do it, what state agency is going to do it? I mean, in general, for us in local, we can deny a project as a final decision, and it's an order, and it's kind of a pain. But some of these simpler questions, I'm going to say they're completely simple. You don't want them tied up in the appeals process, but more of a group that has some experience in doing this and being, like you guys, all of us, subject matter experts. You come in, you tell us what the issues are, and is it okay or is it not okay to build there? I mean, when we roll it out, local health, we're going to want to know who's going to make that final decision? Because all the commissions are going to be coming to us. I don't know if Greg has any other thoughts on that, but in a local level, that is my biggest concern is with what you guys are discussing right now.
All right, so do we have any other ideas, I guess, for moving it forward? It seems like the ideas we've had pretty much go to your group, Sonia.
We're meeting today, aren't we?
You know who we are later.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and again, you know, I think it's acceptable to put forward long-term, short-term solutions, right? So short-term, we know that in the immediate need, right, to time is money, right? If that's the hat we're wearing. And the immediate need is there needs to be a dedicated funding source to bring on new staff, to move the boxes of projects that are sitting in my office right now, right? That moves things forward. That is a short-term fix, right? That can, I think, reasonably be done. Long-term is we need to spend more time, you know, developing a better process for nitrogen and bacteria and coming up with a different strategy, but we need more time to do that.
Agreed.
Yes.
So maybe it's time to consider what out of Matt's proposal do we want to, I mean, I don't know where we are with that, Matt. But is there anything out of that proposal that do we go right back to Matt and just say, okay, we're gonna go with Matt's?
I would say as well, before we get into Matt's proposal, is thinking about short term and long term. And I guess this is a question for the group. Obviously, we heard from folks in Massachusetts, and we heard about the data collection that they do. And it seems to me like that's something that we may want to consider emulating here in the state of Connecticut, correct? And if so, is that a short-term goal or a long-term goal? It seems pretty imperative to me that we ought to be specifically tracking failures and what that might entail. So is that a short-term, long-term goal in anyone's mind?
I think it's gotta be, you might be able to bifurcate it a little bit. And so in the near term, right, like the state has, I'm gonna call it an antiquated data system. It's a beast. It's not user-friendly. It's really hard to get information out of. In the short term, right, kind of let's look at updating data systems and data collection methods, right? Because that's what we all talked about in the very beginning, right? We're missing data, right? Just about systems themselves, never mind the monitoring component, right? The fundamental things need to get captured, but again, time to do that, resources to do it. So we need a data system to be able to handle that kind of stuff. I'm not saying we need a new database. There needs to be more resources allocated to that, right? And I'm sure DPH is in the same boat. We just don't have them. They don't exist. My team makes stuff up on Google Forms because we don't have contracts in place for that. So I think short term, that can be something. Longer term is really understanding what kind of data, right, that we want to be able to capture. We could pull all sorts of information out of an application today, and I could have somebody manually enter it, but I don't have anybody to do that, right? And that just circles back to like the resources issue. If we can identify what things we need to start capturing data on, that also could be short term.
One thing that I envision is that database is almost going to be an absolute necessity if the AT comes to DPH.
Yeah.
So in my mind's eye, that's kind of at that time, that's definitely going to be the point that something like that has to be implemented. And then we can get into the weeds and the details at that time of what exactly goes into it. But that's in my mind's eye, that's when I think that, I mean, I would like it sooner for sure, but I think it's going to have to happen then. Absolutely. Especially if you're, for individual residential homes and things like that for AT, you have to have a tracking mechanism for sure.
We have a challenge right now, right? Just getting our current permittees, so they're bigger, right, than 7,500 to actually report data on time. I must have 70 systems that don't report data like they're supposed to. You know, and that's another challenge, right? But again, that gets back to resources. We don't have the resources or the mechanisms in place to be able to tackle the noncompliance. So there needs to be a fundamental shift in some of that as well.
I suppose collecting that data and then contemplating how that data is utilized, right?
Right.
Well,
Yep.
so obviously, if the data comes back and we find that there may be particular systems that are, from a specific manufacturer that are failing,
Yep.
how do we address that? And if the data comes back showing that there really isn't the production or the benefits to nitrogen
Mhm.
that may or may not be there, then we ought to be saying we need to be reviewing our regulations and technical standards on a regular basis to reflect what the data is showing, right?
Would we be comfortable relying on, and I don't know much about Mass Tech because I'm not from around here all the time. So would we be comfortable relying on the information that comes out of there when they evaluate those types of treatment systems, right? Because then you could really narrow down the field and say you can only put in these systems because we know these.
Well, yeah, let's hold off on what the evaluation might be. I think if we could get the database going as soon as possible, I mean, they have the database. And when I look at this whole process, if we had facts, I mean, a lot of what we're being, I guess, the pushback to Stu's proposal is, look, we've got all these problems, but we can't find them. You know, Stu's perspective was the DPH methodology was working. We're not aware of lots of problems. So therefore, that's what the basis of his entire proposal was. You know, a property line didn't matter. Unfortunately, we didn't have the data. We had people speculating or reporting problems, but we couldn't, we asked for that, I think, from the DEP and DPH. And I believe we just heard back that there was no data available.
It's just not tracked, right? It's not tracked.
I get it.
No.
So, but that's a real waste for our state. I mean, we put all this effort in. We really need to now start getting that database going, that tracking. I talked to the Mass Tech Center. They said that they'd be happy. They would actually do it for free if the software could come to us. They would, for $60 a site, I think it was, for an AT site, for all the ones that you have trouble tracking down and when people don't send the data, they would manage that for $60 a year. The site would pay for it, and they would actually, for $60 a year, make the enforcement calls.
So under a regulatory structure, I don't know how that works in Massachusetts, but we now get into delegation of authority. And so I can't imagine DEEP is going to delegate regulatory authority to a third party, like a private entity.
I
We
don't
don't
know
do that
they,
anywhere.
I would imagine they would, the computer, you would understand. So this computer is going to track everything for you, and then it can send out violations. I mean, presumably
we have a
it's in your
system.
specification.
We have a system in place. We have data components in place that can do that already. We don't have people to get it off the ground. It already exists. I don't want to track data in two different places.
Then they're gonna build an interface with DEP that simply pings DEP and says, send out an NOV. That's, there's ways to do it.
No, well, I guess that's what I'm saying.
Computer
Those systems already exist with EPA's ISIS system, right? We already use that when we're getting net DMR data. I run a quarterly noncompliance report. It comes back to me and it tells me how many people are in noncompliance. It's the next step. That data system, the federal data system, is not connected to the state data system. And so you just need people. We need more people to be able to bring that part online.
Well, they're doing it without those people. So I think as a
They're a
group,
private company.
I think as a group, there is one thing that we have to do, and is make a difference going forward. And the way we've been managing it is not okay. So I think we
Agreed.
have to, I mean, it shouldn't be acceptable to you, Audra. It shouldn't be acceptable
No.
to anybody on this committee. And we need to make a difference on something. If we can't save the cost of housing today, maybe we can help people going forward. And we certainly should be tracking the performance of any system in Connecticut. And if there are problems, we should be taking action on that. the protection of the water is too important. So I
I
think,
agree.
that is something I think that if we can't all as a group agree that we need to get that implemented as soon as possible, it's probably not worth spending time working on this anymore.
Well, I guess, and Sonia, I'll let you, because I know you have your hand up. I'm saying I don't think where we're sitting today that we need to bring in a whole number of third party. That you're talking about contracts and you're talking about sole sourcing and you're talking about, there are a lot of administrative like hurdles that I don't do a lot of outside contracting, but I hear a lot of horror stories about it. I think there are systems in place today that we could start to put together to make that happen. But again,
This
it
is
goes
a
back to
proven-
time.
This is a proven, we should try to figure out, this is not only a proven system, it's also a system with a big database attached to it. So we would get the value you talked about. How do we decide what technology do we want in Connecticut? That database already has a lot of that information in there. It
Well, that's
will
what I'm
tell you
saying.
which systems work. And I think if we could all help Connecticut become part of a larger database, so our knowledge is increased from that and our decision making is better.
So again, it goes back to some of the roadblocks that I see currently with that is just sole sourcing that type of work out. They're not a vendor. There are administrative hurdles from the Department of Administrative Services about trying to bring something like that on board with contract language, right? So it's a roadblock that isn't, insurmountable. It's not as easy as saying, yep, we're going to go do that thing right there.
I understand. Hey,
Okay.
Jim, is there a way to legislatively say Connecticut will build a database or will hire somebody to build a database that will manage it for DEP, Department of Health, and all the health departments?
Yeah, I mean, I think before we get there, David, let's respect the fact that we have consensus here that data collection is
Yeah.
something that we all think is a priority, right? So
Yeah.
beyond that, the methodology for collecting that data and the structure that under which we collect that data, maybe that is, maybe not necessarily a short-term or a long-term goal, but something in between. And we could even recommend a small working group or something of interested individuals and regulators that discuss, maybe explore other states and best practices on how to do that. I mean, I don't know if, and again, that could be legislated, of course, but whether that's necessary or not, I think that remains to be seen, right? We could have conversations, with Audra's group, DPH folks, and the legislature to see if there could be some sort of consensus about the structure for getting there.
Yeah, I don't know if it needs to be legislated. Like that's something that the agency that I've wanted to do since I started here. It's something that we're already starting to look into. So just to be able to provide the electronic data that we did earlier in the beginning of this process was I'll say proof that is working. But it's baby steps to get there, right? And again, it gets back to the resources and the management is you need to have enough people to do that.
Yeah, and it might be as simple as, David, conversations with Massachusetts and maybe if, the software being utilized, was it ISIS, you said, if it's satisfactory, but it's just a matter of, the staffing and resources to utilize that existing software to get the information out. Maybe that sounds like that could very well be the case. But if not, it could be that a small group is put together, identify other states that seem to be, doing data collection at an exceptional level and seeing whether or not there are best practices to emulate. Matt had his hand up for a while. I don't know if
Yeah, no, I'm still here. Just real quick. The only thing I just want to make a point of, if we wanted a true statewide database, what I would say who would be entering the data would be the locals. I mean, they're the ones with the access. So that is definitely a burden on them. So you have to take that into consideration. And then I would see then, let's say either DPH or DEP sees that database and controls it. But ultimately, the people that are going to be entering that data, 99% of it is going to be done at the local level. So I'm not an attorney, but I'm just curious to see, because obviously the locals get dumped on all the time. Is that something we would actually legislatively require them to do in order for them to say, no, we're not going to do it? Or is that just something we can say, no, you're going to do it, and they're going to do it?
Yeah, you could. I'll let Sonia speak. My assumption obviously is that we could mandate anything of the towns. It's whether or not CCM is going to come along and have some pointed conversations about unfunded mandates, right? But my assumption is that the locals are already collecting a lot of this data, right? But to Audra's description, it's going into a box, in the hallway in front of her office, right? So collection, it sounds like, it is not necessarily the issue, right?
In Mass, Jim, in Mass, the operators put it in, so the site pays the fee. It's I think it's $60 a year for AT sites. For other sites that are simple like septic system, just a regular leaching system, it wouldn't be. But the person that's responsible to operate it or who licensed to install it enters the data in. So there's no cost to the state. There's no work demand to the state. That's why that's such a, I think, a good system.
So that system already exists in the NetDMR platform, right? When we issue a permit, we tell folks you have to enter your electronic data into NetDMR. It's a CDX platform run by the federal government. That data then comes to us. It gets fed into ISIS, and then we're able to pull it out. That's how I get my non-compliance report. That already exists.
Is it accurate? Do you find that did they do the right thing though?
Well, I'll say they enter data sometimes, but more often than not, they don't submit the data. Okay. But the numeric data that comes out is, it's data in, data out. If they're gonna provide junk, then it's junk. So maybe it might be helpful if maybe not today, right? I can show you how we manage the data through the state system, which is referred to as SIMS. And the connection points, right? So I can put together a diagram to show you all that stuff already exists.
So one of the things I think when George spoke to us, he said that in that database they use, even identifies what the data that seems to be not correct.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and that happens in any system, right? The data is only as good as the person who took the sample, who analyzed the sample, who entered the data, right? That exists.
Well, this one would go back to that. It would flag that entry, and it would go back to the person who entered it and to the and to the enforcing group.
So again, those systems already kind of exist here. It's just a matter of time and resources, right? We spend the two resource people I have issuing permits and not focus on the other side.
Okay, what does Sonia have?
Sonia.
Hi. Okay, so there's like two things that we're talking about. When you guys are dealing with failures, it's because of certain parameters are off. When we're dealing with failures on local level, it's probably because the system backed up or is flowing out of the ground. Mm-hmm. So like those things are not as easy to evaluate. I'm not saying that yours is easy, because obviously it's not. But we're not checking for nitrogen, we're not checking for phosphorus, and if they're exceeding levels or whatnot. What we are checking for is the fill, the system, the history, the installation. And these are quite extensive to do for just one property. And we don't have a database. And one thing that DPH, we do have lots of different databases that we use at DPH and at DEP. There's like lots of them that we use in local health. Just whenever, and we do discuss this, like I'm so very, very much interested in what you guys are talking about, because we do need AT down here. We do need to have it monitored. That is like 1000% correct. You guys are hitting it on the head. When we do AT, especially single family residential, that is where local health needs to get those alerts if it's a WPCA or local health. The other part, which is what Matt's group is, we don't have a central database. So even if we were to say systems are failing, we don't have anything to back that up. You'd have to go through every single health department, ask them, and is it a premature failure for what reason? Is it the reason why the system got put in wrong? Or is it because it got put into wetlands? There's so many different reasons why it could be. I'm just saying that those databases may be together, but they may not look the same.
Well, in Mass, what they proposed was that something like a simple septic system, you would record the date it was installed. You might record the water meter reading, for instance. And then if it failed in the first 10 years, it would flag it, and you know it failed because that address would come back up for the site of another installation. Now, it wouldn't tell you why it failed, but if all of a sudden brand X had 100 failures and brand Y had 2, there'd be a statistical conclusion there. So I guess we're coming down to 4 minutes left, and I guess we got, do we have anything to recommend?
Yeah. Well, I think we've made some progress here, David. Yeah, despite your tone. But you know, I think we're exploring short-term, long-term options. You know, clearly funding is something that, you know, we could you know, suggest in tandem with some of the other groups, probably the both of the other groups, and certainly data collection, right? And then I guess we have to kind of circle back, have another conversation, another meeting where we can talk about Matt's proposal again, talk about, you know, what we can do in the short term to either you know, move forward with Matt's concept or alter it in one way, shape, or form. But I think that's where you know, if we want to find consensus and we want to find the short-term solutions that we can include in a report, that's probably where we need to focus moving forward. I do think, to me, that doesn't mean that Stu's proposal lacks merit in any way, shape, or form. I actually think it's a direction that we should all ought to continue to explore, and maybe that is also a long-term, you know, a recommendation as well. And how that is discussed and considered in what data we need to determine whether or not it's an appropriate direction to move into is how we probably should couch that moving forward, right?
And this might be something that might, you know, again, just building off that for next time for, you know, I'm not aware of the specific concerns that the community had with Matt's original proposal. So I don't know that those were ever really public or not, but that would be helpful to understand from where I'm sitting, is to really like, what was it specifically about the proposal that caused the roadblocks, right? Or were perceived roadblocks that really wouldn't allow things to move forward, right? Maybe not, you know, 10,000 houses next year forward, but to move things forward. I don't know if that's something that we want to talk about as a group.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad idea. Obviously, it wasn't just the home builders, but
Yeah.
you know, the sanitarians had issues as well. And so those concerns might be varied based on who you're asking. So, but yeah, worth having that be part of the conversation. And David, you know, when putting together the agenda, maybe we should add that line item for our next meeting. We are 1 minute away from concluding this meeting. David, you know, I think we should have a meeting as early as next week. You know, given the lateness of the hour and the time frame under which we need to conclude our business. So it might be best to figure out scheduling, you know, in the next day or so, and you know, inform the group about when we think the best time and date to meet again would be.
That sounds like a plan. Well,
Sonia's
Yes,
got,
Sonia.
One thing. Stu, I think your proposal is wonderful. I don't want you to think that I'm knocking it in any way. I just think we need a way to get there. That's all. I just wanted to make sure that I give credit to you because it was a very thought out process, and I know your frustrations as I feel them myself down here. So I just wanted to say.
No, I appreciate it, but don't think I'm frustrated. This was something, like I said, I've been thinking about this literally since day one, and I go back to what conversation that I had with Randy Mang when I first started the business over 40 years ago. And it just came up. I said, Randy, where did 5,000 gallons a day come from? And he used to smoke a pipe. And well, we were told to start the program and we had to pick a number. And there it was. You know, so it's just been there. And this, you know, I saw this and I said, oh, here's an opportunity to talk about this and figure out maybe a way to, you know, move this forward faster, you know, get everything going, speed up the process. So anyway.
Well,
right.
thank you all. We'll circulate dates for next week, see if we can pull that off. Everybody has so much time this time of year.
Yeah. Right.
All right,
right.
thank you.
Thank you, everybody.